and gentlemen, and welcome to episode number 338 of the Zombie Train. I'm your host, Ellis, otherwise known as the Admiral, and this week we are taking a question from East Rail 11 on our rivals. Now, I need to go and look up the full text of this question. I apologize for not doing it in advance for once, but I feel like a lot of the stuff I have actually gone over, some of it fairly recently, even talking like a couple episodes ago with the Band of Guardians and stuff like that. So this was a question back on episode 276. And let's see what all was being said in this question. So, how often would you find engines or rolling stock vanished? Oh my god, there were a lot of questions in here. I'm trying to figure out which one this was. Oh, did any larger railroad CEO or high personnel survive to help you or start a rival company after World War Z? Okay, that's a little different. To my knowledge, because I wasn't super versed in who was in charge of what afterward. Sorry, before the war, I should say. I wasn't super versed in who was in charge of what before the war. After the Great Panic, I basically couldn't tell individual from individual. Everyone was people. Most people were basically broke, surviving off of what they could farm or what they could scavenge, and it was the few settlements that kept us going. Very few of them were, say, somebody that was super successful beforehand that had found their way out there. See, you can break down what happened to people into basically economic status. The poorest people that were in the city, they were all dead. There was no hope for them. The poorer people or lower middle class people out in the country or in small towns or, whatever, a lot of them were able to band together and survive in one way or another. They made up the bulk of the survivors. The middle class people that lived in cities or suburbs, a lot of them tried to make it out or hunker down, and most of them didn't survive particularly long. I've talked in depth, and Max Brooks goes in depth, on what happened to a lot of the families that made that northerly trek, which I've mentioned before. Most people didn't survive, or a lot of people didn't survive the journey, and then most people that did slowly ran out of resources and were unable to fend for themselves and either fought each other or were eventually overcome by a timely arrival of zombies. So that leaves the more upper class people. Now some people had some pretty lavish estates to run off to, but they weren't able to keep up a supply of things, and so a lot of them, I don't know what happened to them. I assume they went off to wherever they thought was safe and died there eventually after running out of supplies. I mean, a few people had bunkers and stuff, but very few of the rich and famous, whether you're a movie star or a railroad executive, had like a bunker stocked with years of supplies. And yeah, you can send out people to help you and scavenge for you and stuff like that, but at the end of the day, that just consumes more supplies more quickly. That's not something that you want. That doesn't help you in general. That isn't to say. So there were a few people, not people that I can name necessarily, because I was never up on celebrities in the first place, and a lot of businessmen or businesswomen, business people that had a lot of money and a lot of power and a lot of prowess, and were able to organize things. Your average celebrity doesn't have what it takes to run what's effectively a small colony, but then again, neither do most normal people. So that isn't a dig on celebrities, that's just, well, you're rich and famous, but you don't have the managerial experience. So, some business people, some of the better off business people, they did end up making little colonies for themselves effectively. There were people that ended up living on islands or taking over islands and controlling them. But those weren't people that I ended up dealing with, because they were out in wherever. A couple of the small towns were sort of homegrown estates, but a lot of the people that had it well off at the beginning of the war either died to a variety of causes that were a direct result of the war, or were super flamboyant about being rich, and that led to trouble for them. Because a lot of people with not a lot of resources looking at these very rich people, yeah. There were some pretty grisly attacks on wealthy folks' estates, from my understanding. This is not something I participated in, but I know that it happened. So, railroad executives, I honestly can't think of any whose name comes to mind. The only person I can think of is Hunter Harrison, but he didn't have any sort of role. He was dead long before he could have possibly come back with a railroad company. So, yeah, I mean, a lot of these executives, too, they were older, and maybe they weren't in the best of health, despite what they had in terms of money, and so they ended up dying because they can't get the medicine they need. And that just goes for old people in general. You get a bunch of freaky old zombies that are just, that are even worse shape than a normal zombie because they're old. But, once you're undead, you don't need your meds anymore. People just kept on trucking. Anyway, or dead people, I guess. Not that that's something to be super excited about. Grandma isn't going to make you cookies when she's a zombie. I feel like it's too soon to make those jokes. There are kids now who grew up knowing, with the war having only been out of memory. There are children of the war that maybe their first couple of years were during some of the tough fighting or during the rebuilding, but they really never knew consciously what it was like to live in a world at war like that, or even especially before the war. And I suppose you could compare it to children like myself who were growing up, who were very, very young when 9/11 happened, and they never knew what it was like to live in the world of pre-9/11, really. And at the same time, they don't really understand what the impact of that was. They just understand that it was bad. And we have kids that are growing up that really don't know the war, and so maybe it's okay to start making these jokes, but I don't know. There are too many people, everybody globally that's under or that's over a certain age is going to have strong memories. I mean, if you were an adolescent when the war hit, then absolutely you're, and if you made it through, that's a big deal. That's going to define the rest of your life. So that's interesting because I wasn't that old when it happened, so I would be one of the older, I guess the World War Z generation. I don't know. I don't think people have started defining that yet. I haven't heard talks about it, but whatever. I've been caught up in building up a railroad empire and then slowly dialing it back. So right now there are, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 major railroads that I can think of that have been taking over transcon routes and long-haul routes and local services from the zombie train. I'm not sure if you could really call them class 1s. They're not very large, and they don't move a lot of carloads. But they are the biggest thing that we've got in terms of private enterprise in this country right now. at least as far as railroading goes, but maybe overall. And they were founded by people who, to my knowledge, were not in the railroad industry beforehand. So these are... And I wouldn't even call them rivals, I wrote this question down as rivals, but it really does seem like you're asking about... you did say rivals, but in the context of knowing what goes on and what went on in the history of the zombie train, it's much less of a rivalry and much more of a... We're beginning to break up this monopoly conglomerate that is the Zombie Train Incorporated and start to hand things off to everybody else. Start to return things to the private freight companies that no longer existed, but that have come back in their new forms, I suppose. I don't think there are any continued direct lineages to the major railroads from before the Great Panic, but I hope you understand my meaning. So they aren't really rivals per se, even though, they sort of spring up and they do a little bit of something, and usually they'll lease some equipment from us or whatever, and they'll take over something relatively minor, and then they'll get good at that, and then ask to take over something bigger. And we have a pretty robust program in place for handing over lines and services at this point, and we try to retain trackage rights on basically anything we hand over. So we have trackage rights over the entire country still, or 3 countries really, but over the entire continent, I should say. But at the same time, we don't really need to exercise that because our day in the sun is coming to a close over here. So, with that in mind, I don't really consider these companies to be rivals. The rivals that we had were not rivals trying to do other railroad things. They were people that were trying to undermine our railroad things. Individuals like Weibold or the Toronto Rail Lands, or groups like Beta Rail, Toronto Rail Lands. They were never in it to take stuff away from us. It's the end of the world. It's apocalypse now, and people are at each other's throats for a lot of things, but when you have enough clout that you are tooling around in a locomotive trying to help people, you want to work with the people around you. So, I think for that reason, we never saw a similar company or group spring up that was hostile towards us. Now, and that really is just the Zombie Train era, because once the Zombie Train Incorporated kicked off, nobody else was really doing anything. Everybody else was either with us or no longer with us. And the whole of the railroad system of the North American continent was basically our oyster. We were given unilateral permission by the U.S. government and military, and they would back that up. Not that they ever needed to, but they would. We never really went into contested areas, into, like, middle to South Mexico or anything like that, but, that is where we had a lot of actual, like, oh, there's a group here that's actually fairly violent towards us. Let's just stay out of their hair. Anyway, we did have to steal some locomotives from Mexico, but I've talked about that before. And that's when we realized, oh, there's a cartel, and they're still running everything. They've got a little mini civilization set up, and they don't like people poking at it. Anyway, I hope that answered your question. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode of The Zombie Train. Remember to leave questions and comments below, of course, and I will see you next week. This is the Admiral, signing off.